Hello everyone and welcome to Fiction Friday. This is our third Fiction Friday and I'm looking forward to this one. It's kind of near and dear to me, although I guess they all have been. So this week we're going to be talking about dialogue, what dialogue is, how it works, a little bit of examples of some good dialogue, what good dialogue is, how it should function, stuff like that. And I'm going to do mostly short stories is what I'm going to be talking about. I think dialogue plays a much bigger role in short stories, even though I think that there's less of it in short stories than novels. But it's applicable to just about all fiction, what I'm going to be talking about. So I highly recommend you also comment any questions below. Feel free. I am 100% available to answer any questions, and you can go ahead and respond to the writing exercises that I'll have at the end of this video. So let's start with just the definition of dialogue. What is dialogue? Dialogue is really just anything a character says. So anything characters speak or say, even if it's not in quotations, is dialogue. Now this means technically that, as we learned with our first video, some points of view where the character is the narrator also, that would mean technically that all of the narration is dialogue, in that it's sort of conveyed to the reader as a book, but that's not really how people think about dialogue, and that's not really exactly a working definition for what I'm going to be talking about. So let's just say that it's anything that characters say, and that's not necessarily in quotations, although most of the time it's in quotations. There are really four main types of dialogue. There's reported or summarized dialogue. There's what I call two-way dialogue. There's one-way dialogue, and then what I call one-sided dialogue. So those are kind of my four main definitions of what dialogue is. And let's go ahead and break those down. So reported or summarized dialogue is exactly what it sounds like. It's dialogue that isn't in quotation marks, that is summarized to the reader. So summary dialogue is really easy. It's a super useful sort of dialogue. It's a way to quickly dispense information that was spoken. Maybe a character overheard it, but to put it in quotation marks and put it in real time is kind of not beneficial. It slows the pace. And maybe it's a lot of information that you don't want to have somebody just kind of spew out. That's really boring. And people take what's in quotations as readers take it very seriously. They really pay attention to what's in quotations. So when you have really information heavy stuff in quotations, it loses what is considered an artistic value. And it just becomes an info dump, and it doesn't feel natural, even though we do actually talk that way. It doesn't feel like we talk that way. So that's not really a great way to do it. Reported and summarized dialogue, that's a perfect way to get rid of information very quickly. Not get rid of, but convey information very quickly that characters spoke to each other. This is just like, even if it's just a greeting, those are terrible in quotations. Bob said hello. I said hello back. That's reported, that's summarized. Otherwise it would be, hello, I said. Bob said, hello, how are you? I'm fine. That's really boring as opposed to just saying, I said good morning to Bob on my way to the office. That's a lot easier. So the next type of dialogue is what I call two-way dialogue, and that's kind of what it sounds like as well. Two-way dialogue is a debate or an argument or a negotiation, etc., anything like that, in which two characters are talking in quotations to each other, two or more. You can have more, but as long as there are two characters or more that are both speaking, not necessarily equal amounts, but both speaking, and they're both in quotations, or most of their dialogue is in quotations, that's going to be what I call two-way dialogue. Most dialogue in a story is this, but it needs to have some finesse. I'll get into that when I talk about what good dialogue is, but it shouldn't be just call and response. So if it's hello, how are you, I'm well, blah, blah, that's technically two-way dialogue. But normally, most good two-way dialogue is a negotiation of some sort. It's either an argument or a debate, or someone's flirting, or someone's trying to get something from the other that the other either doesn't want them to have or is trying to get something in return for. That's going to be most two-way dialogue. Next up is one-way dialogue, and that is very similar to two-way dialogue, except instead of both or more parties talking, one is doing the talking, and the other is either doing the listening or the reacting non-verbally. So one person is going to be giving a diatribe or a speech or a monologue, sort of, etc. There's a bunch of different things that look like this. A lot of Shakespeare's plays have monologues, but that's not quite exactly what I mean. It can be very effective for characterization and plot when you have characters kind of speaking at people. Unfortunately, it runs the risk of being kind of a dump of exposition, like I was talking about earlier, that would have been better serviced by summary or reported dialogue. But it can work really well, especially depending on the character's role. Like if the character's a politician or something like that, sometimes it can be really nice to see some of their speech in quotations and then some of their speech as summarized dialogue, and then also narrative describing how the crowd reacts. That would be one-way dialogue when it's in quotations, but the summarized then would be the out of quotations, and then the narrative exposition would be how the crowd reacts. So one-way dialogue can work. It's the easiest one to fall into the trap of, let me go ahead and tell you my entire plan. I'm the villain, this is what I was thinking all along, or I'm the prisoner, this is blah, blah, blah. It's when characters explain everything, that is when one-way dialogue becomes not good. And then finally, the fourth one, one-sided dialogue, is inherently very interesting. So one-sided dialogue is dialogue that is overheard by a character kind of observing. This is really more like when we're in first person or we're in close third and we don't get into the minds of others, and we're maybe a sleuth, or maybe we're a child coming downstairs overhearing our parents, stuff like this. Maybe, the speaker doesn't know that the listener is there. That's going to be one-sided dialogue. Phone calls are very much one-sided dialogue if the listener is the character whose head we get in, and they're the point of view, and then somebody talking on the phone is who we're listening to. So the person talking on the phone, we only hear what they say. We don't hear what the person on the other side says. And that can be really revealing. I actually used an example of that in my point of view video, which I thought was really good. It's Out of the Mouth of Babes is the short story. And honestly, just read the short story. It's incredible. But it's the little kid is talking to a Terminator, a pest Terminator kind of thing. And he's got this coupon and he's like, yes, hello, I've got this deal. And the babysitter overhears him. I think it's a phenomenal example of this. So phone calls are very much the norm for that, but there are other things that operate this way. So like texts, emails, and letters to an unresponsive lover maybe, or to a supervisor that just isn't listening, or maybe it's just a supervisor. I think George Saunders has one where the supervisor of a little barbarian, early man sort of display in a museum theme park / thing. The guy who we follow is one of the stone men, and his stone age wife is there, and he's kind of pretending to be a stone man for people visiting, and their supervisor, their boss, is constantly leaving little letters addressing them, but we never see him, and the letters are hilarious. That's one-sided dialogue. Technically, I think you could consider it that, even though that's actually a little bit more one-way dialogue. So one-sided dialogue might be interviews, like David Foster Wallace's Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. We don't get the questions, we just get the answers. So the listener is us, but we didn't hear the asker, we only hear the answerer. So it's kind of an interesting, weird sort of thing. You could consider one-sided dialogue, I suppose, questions to like a religious figure or a deity, although that also is getting close to one-way dialogue. It really just depends on whether or not the listener is aware, or the speaker is aware that the listener is hearing them. There is a listener, there's an intended listener, but then there might be other listeners. If the other listener is not intended, that's one-sided dialogue, not one-way dialogue. At least that's my working definition of it. Okay, so moving on. Those are kind of the four main types of dialogue. Let's kind of talk about what good dialogue is. So any dialogue that is in quotation marks should be doing double duty, if you ask me. I'm not going to really be talking about summarized dialogue. That's pretty straightforward. It's really just narrative. It's summary. It's tell, which I've talked about before. And, you know, you can do it well, you can do it poorly, but doing it well is a lot easier than doing dialogue well. Dialogue in quotations. And part of that is just because readers are sort of attuned to taking anything that's in quotation marks very seriously. Not that like they take the joke very seriously if it's in quotation marks, but they pay a lot of attention. They put a lot of emphasis on their reading of quotation marks. I'm not sure why. It's just been my personal experience with my own readers. It's been my experience as a reader. It's just what we do. So what makes good dialogue then is any dialogue that's in quotation marks has to be working really hard. It has to earn that emphasis, or else it doesn't really deserve the quotation marks. That's really extreme, but I think it's good practice. I don't think it's a hard and fast rule, but it's a nice thing to kind of keep in mind. So what do I mean by double duty that dialogue should be doing? Well, there's text and there's subtext in all dialogue. When you say something, that's the text. And then there's the underlying meaning that we know from the connotations and the contextualization of the situation that the person actually meant. And a lot of people do this every day, especially when they're talking with like a supervisor or a parent. You're going to respond in a particular way so that what you say isn't at all offensive, but maybe you meant some offense, and maybe you said it in such a way that the parent or supervisor could pick up on it, but there isn't any actual textual proof, so they have to just sort of accept that. That's kind of fun. That's a fun aspect of being human, is our control of language and doing weird things like that. But that's the subtext, and that's the really important part of dialogue. So if your dialogue is all text, that's going to be, one, extremely boring. There's not going to be a whole lot for us as readers to see going on, because most of the time that text is going to be like, I went to the bank today. What did you do at the bank? I took out money at the bank. And that inherently isn't very interesting. So there's no tension there. Subtext is what affords all dialogue tension. Like I said, all good dialogue is a negotiation. And for good dialogue to operate this way, there needs to be that sort of not call and response, but answering around. So somebody wants something, and the other person either doesn't want them to have it, or also wants it, or isn't gonna give it to them, whatever it is. And the way the dialogue works well then is when somebody sort of insinuates, they get close to the mark, and then that person kind of either retracts or puts up a barrier, but they don't directly respond to that. You can ask a really serious, straightforward question in a short story. You can be like, are you having an affair? If the person is, and they don't want them to find out, they're going to say no, but they're going to try and kind of deflect. They're going to work around. Things are going to be spinning around a center of gravity without ever actually reaching that center of gravity. So good dialogue does this orbit of touching upon the essence of something without actually explicitly saying it, because then that lets the reader sort of feel the tension, and it doesn't become call and response, which is very dull and very dry and very repetitive in short stories especially, but in novels as well. So if you have dialogue where people aren't quite addressing each other, that's really good. I think a really good kind of practice thing to do, something that I like to do anyway, is have a character ask a question, have the other character essentially talk as if they didn't even hear the question, have that character respond, have the first character then respond to that thing, and then the second character responds to the original first question. It adds sort of like a weird cadence and rhythm, and it throws things off just a little bit so that it's not a normal call and response. Like, let's say you needed that information in there, but you didn't want it to be call and response. That's a really quick, easy way to make it just a little bit more interesting. It can become gimmicky though, so don't use it frequently. Excuse me. Sometimes the subtext is really dependent on the contextual actions and responses, as well as the contextualizing history of the story and the two characters. So all of that is not going to come out in dialogue. That's going to be in the way characters respond to things, or it's going to be in the stuff we've already learned throughout the story. So that information is really important to set up the subtext, which is why a story that's just dialogue, it's not impossible to have subtext, but it's harder. So dialogue works best actually when it's used very precisely. So you don't want to set up a lot of information and have these long conversations. Instead, you kind of want to breeze through them. You want to use that summary dialogue until you get to those really precise, really emphatic moments of dialogue. And actually, I think that adds greater emphasis then to the reader who's looking for that emphatic quotation mark. And then they get the contextualized history, they get that punch, and it really draws everything out that you meant for the conversation to do. So, if you're just sitting there with a bunch of lines of dialogue and then back and forth dialogue, it becomes repetitive and it gets kind of dull, and there's not anything to break up the dialogue so that we know which parts really matter. For whatever reason, in short stories, especially, the way you can kind of tell something matters is if it's different from what's around it. So if you have a lot of dialogue that you want to matter, you've got to put it amid narrative, not on its own. Just because we'll see the narrative, we'll see the dialogue, we'll realize that those two are working in tandem and they're both pretty meaningful. If you see a lot of dialogue, it's really hard to make sure it's meaningful. So good dialogue also has voice, and what that means is just that characters are going to talk differently, especially depending on who they are, like not as their name, but what they do as a profession, their education, where they're from, what they like to eat, even, I would imagine, what their hobbies and interests are. Sometimes my woodworking hobby leaks into my jargon, and I sort of make idioms and expressions similar to woodworking. I've also been talking a lot more in millimeters lately because I've been working in millimeters for woodworking. So that's something to keep in mind. So good dialogue has voice. The characters will own the dialogue that they're speaking. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to be talking like Huckleberry Finn, but it's just word choice more than something like cutting G's off at the end of words, stuff like that. That's pretty gimmicky, but keeping word choice in mind, especially keeping your character's interests in mind, is really helpful for choosing the right jargon to make sure that they come off a certain way. And that actually just plays into good characterization overall. If you have a character who's like a baker, if they think in terms of powdered sugar and stuff like that, it's going to be a little bit more interesting. And lastly, good dialogue doesn't actually sound like speech. So if you listen to people talking to each other, it's really dry. It's not very interesting generally, especially if you like sit down. Can't right now, obviously, but if you were sitting down at like a Panera or an Applebee's or whatever, wherever you like to go get your food, and you just kind of listen to other people talking, it's very dull. And that's just because speech uses a lot of likes and ums and so's, like I've been doing. But if you put that in a story, it's going to come off one way, and unless you really want it to come off that way, it's bad. So maybe you're doing a particular person who talks with a lot of likes. You can put a lot of likes in there, but generally it's better to find some other sort of really distinctive aspect of their speech patterns, just because it's not fun, it's not interesting, and it gets really boring and repetitive pretty quick if you actually mirror speech. So a good thing to do is to read your dialogue out loud. And if it's something that you wouldn't necessarily say, but it's the essence of something you would say, that's probably pretty good dialogue. If it sounds like something you would say without reading a script, it's probably not working out too well. You're probably using a lot of wells and so's and anyways. And that's one thing. I don't recommend it. Some characters deserve it, but most characters don't. So just keep in mind, what your dialogue actually is sounding like. And the best way to do that is to read it. To talk about now what dialogue can achieve for a story or its usefulness, there's some things to keep in mind with dialogue that I don't think you need to think about with other aspects, especially like characterization, setting, stuff like that. That dialogue shares a lot more with plot. And most of the time, tension and conflict between characters is built so that one has the upper hand over the other. That's just, I mean, that's kind of the basis of conflict. One character has an upper hand over the other. And this inherently lends itself to then high tension scenes feature shifts in this power. And dialogue is kind of how that shift occurs, unless it's like a race movie or like a superhero movie or something like that. Speed Racer, the shift in power is going to be when he hits the nitrous oxide or whatever, and the car just zooms ahead. But for most of us in short stories, dialogue is going to be how characters exchange their power and make these power plays. It's going to be revelatory of information that maybe one character has that the other doesn't, and then when they reveal it to them, the field has completely changed. They no longer have the upper hand. They realize that, they're at a weakness. A lot of political dramas do this pretty well, and a lot of like TV shows have this going on. Look for any situation where a character who's all high and mighty by the end of the scene is not so high and mighty and they don't have a lot to say. I didn't really watch Game of Thrones, but I think I saw a few episodes where people are doing that a lot. Of course, there's also a lot of scenes in Game of Thrones where the upper hand is changed with a swing of the sword or a firing of the arrow. But otherwise, if you're not going to actually physically exert your upper hand, it's going to happen with dialogue. So that's what makes dialogue so important, and that's what lends dialogue to aspects of plot. But you don't want the plot to be driven by dialogue. So you want the plot to be in the narrative, and then you want the characters reacting to this tension, this conflict, with their dialogue, subtextually and textually, and then also with their actions and responses. Dialogue is also sometimes the only lens into the heart of certain characters that we have as readers. It depends on the point of view. So if it's a first-person point of view or a very close third, we really will only know what the other characters are thinking if they say it. And so, we can figure out a character is thinking something because they say it, or we can figure out a character is thinking something because they say the opposite and they're being guarded. Dialogue is a really good way to do this. Dialogue is pretty much how you do it. You can't really get into the heads of other characters if you're not doing an omniscient point of view, unless it's through dialogue or it's through reported dialogue or it's like a he said, she said kind of thing. That's just about the only way, other than responses, so their actions in response to certain things. Their emotions sort of become very visual. That runs the risk of being a little melodramatic, but as I sort of talked in Show and Tell, there are good ways to do this. So it's through the coupling of dialogue and their physical responses to situations that you can get inside other characters' heads that you don't have access to as a reader or as the narrator. It's not a cheat, but sometimes you can be very direct with that. And you can have a character just say exactly what they're thinking. Don't do it too often because, again, that's not subtext, that's just text. And just text can be boring. Like I said, dialogue is a good way to pack a punch of emphasis, just like imagery. So the way I was talking with Show and Tell, you want to have a pretty good amount of tell and a couple bits of show in a sort of a summarized bit of narrative to move swiftly, because it really packs that punch. Those images then really stand out. If everything is show, things sort of dry out. Same with dialogue. It's a really good way to, you have a situation and people are kind of acting or doing and not saying, but doing stuff. And then you have one person says just the right thing at that right moment, and everything kind of falls into place or everything falls apart. Punches of dialogue work a lot better than lots of dialogue. Lots of dialogue starts to feel like a movie script. It starts to feel like a noir movie script where the detective is talking really fast and he's hard boiled and he's using lots of cool slang. But that doesn't always really work too well. It has its time and place, and if it's not a detective story, it's not really the time or place, if you ask me. But again, all rules are meant to be broken, so who knows? So kind of the last thing about dialogue's achievements or how it operates. Dialogue, or how to use it, I guess, dialogue can be very grounding. But it's only grounding, if it's only grounding, it's not operating well. So dialogue can really get us into a situation, it can really get us into a scene, we can really get a feel for how everybody thinks about each other. But if it's only doing this grounding, if it's only offering contextualization, if it's only offering exposition, it's not actually operating very well. So dialogue does this really cool thing where it can, because of the subtext and text, it can make us really in the scene. It can bring us really into the scene. We can learn a lot, very factually, but we can also learn a lot very emotionally or very observationally. That's not necessarily factual. It's abstract. It's emotional. So with really good dialogue, you can learn that it's somebody's birthday, and on their birthday, they always go to Yaya's Steakhouse. And at Yaya's Steakhouse, there's always some mess up of the order. But you also know that maybe the person whose birthday it is hates Yaya's, but just does it for the tradition. And maybe the person who always takes them to Yaya's also hates Yaya's, but thinks that they love it. And everybody just never has a good time at Yaya's Steakhouse because they always like burn the steak, or they bring the wrong bottle of wine, or people get drunk. Who knows? So we can learn a lot about the character's interiority while also learning a lot about the story's exterior. And dialogue it's not the only way to do it, but it's a really, really great way to do it. So I've been talking a lot about dialogue, obviously, because that's the subject, but I'd like to give some examples of really good dialogue. I have Maria Reva's book here. It's a collection of short stories, Good Citizens Need Not Fear. It came out pretty recently. It's really good. I highly recommend it. I don't know if we have it on the library's website or not, but you should definitely get it either way. This little bit that I'm going to read is from the first story in it, Novostroyka. And in it, the main character, he's living in a tiny little apartment that he was supposed to have to himself, gifted to him by the Soviet government for his new job. But instead, over a couple of months, 14 people end up living with him in it. Relatives, people who need a place to stay, people moving, people who've lost their jobs, all sorts of stuff. And he's packed in there. And then his job is he's essentially the engineer behind figuring out how to pack the most amount of food into the least amount of for canned goods. Well, they just found out that they're not going to have as much tin for their cans anymore, so they've got to revamp everything. And he realizes that string beans have this tiny triangular space between every pack of 3 that you just can't fill. So he wrote his boss about it. And then the next day, Daniil found another memo on his desk, this one from Sergei Igorovich, his supervisor. To fill unfillable string bean triangular void, engineer triangular vegetable, due Friday. That is really good one-way dialogue. There's no way to respond to that. 1, because it's a memo, and 2, because it's obviously impossible. But it really highlights the impossibility of the situation, the ridiculousness of the situation, and his supervisor's sort of commandingness. In the same story, towards the end of the story, the apartment's packed, they're sitting at home, and somebody in the apartment building dies, so people have come to collect the body, they're carrying it down in the coffin. 2 tall men in black beanies stood in the narrow hallway holding a coffin. Daniil felt himself teeter as his relatives crowded behind him. If you're here to collect me, I'm not ready yet. Most people, no one would say that with a coffin at their door. We need access to your apartment, citizen, the square-jawed man on the right said. See that keyword, citizen? That's that jargon. It's very grounding. Why? Daniil asked. The man on the left, endowed with wet, meaty lips, rolled his eyes at his colleague. God damn it, Petya, do we have to give an explanation at every landing? An explanation would be nice, Danielle insisted. The guy on ninth croaked, and the stair landings aren't wide enough to pivot the coffin, Petya said, so we need to do it inside the apartments. Yet somehow you got all the way up to the ninth. Danielle knew the cabinet-sized elevator wouldn't have been an option. When the coffin was empty, we could turn it upright. And now you can't? Some find that disrespectful, citizen. So that's some pretty good dialogue. It's not call and response. It's kind of intuiting. The next response is what Danielle does, but the other guys are really kind of, they have a jargon. They sound different from the other characters. They're talking a lot about citizens, and then later, the chickens on the balcony come crowding into the apartment as well. Everything goes to pot, and then one of them says, we'll have to report this poultry enterprise, citizens. So it's very grounding. It really sets us in this situation. It also adds conflict and tension. All of a sudden there's this coffin. The coffin's really heavy. It ends up, I'm not going to spoil the story, so I won't. I'm going to stop right there. But it's a really good story, partly because of the dialogue. It's operating really well. That story collection, Good Citizens Need Not Fear, is fantastic for a lot of different reasons, but the dialogue in it is really good. The story just after the first one, Little Rabbit, has a young girl born with a cleft down her nose through her mouth. She can't really talk. So the way that she does dialogue is very interesting. But that kind of is all I have time for dialogue right now. Just kind of a quick last comment. The short story versus novel. Novel has a lot more dialogue, but not just in terms of amount, because that's obvious, but rather proportionally. It affords more space for dialogue. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but it's kind of the norm. That's mostly just because short stories rely on very precise cutting dialogue delivered at just the right moment. And a novel affords more relaxed standards of this because of its length. You don't have to get stuff as perfect, although I kind of hate that term, with novels as you do with short stories. So short stories, don't think so much about having lots of dialogue. If you can get through all of that information very quickly with summarized dialogue, do that instead, and then have one or two clips of dialogue. That works a lot better, actually. One of the biggest mistakes I see early writers making is that their first short stories end up looking more like movie scripts. And some of the fun of writing, like I said with show and tell, is doing that narrative work very quickly and then having those impactful, very forceful punches of images and dialogue and quotations. If you had everything that was images and everything that was dialogue and quotations, that's not going to be a very good story, in my opinion anyway. Lots of people do like stories like that, I suppose. But it loses a lot of aspects that a short story can be if you just use it very intelligently and economically. So that affords you more space for telling, it affords you more space for reporting summarized dialogue. I think it's just an overall better method to get to the meat of what short stories can offer, the magic of short fiction. So that's all I have for today. Go ahead and comment any questions below. I'm going to go ahead and post some prompts for you guys to do for dialogue, and I'd be very interested to see what you're working on for that. So feel free to comment on that below as well. Thanks for joining.